Me tonight, my panel, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, and former Editor of Labourist, Peter Edwards. Good evening, gentlemen. Don't forget, you can get in touch with us all evening, gbviews@gbnews.com or on Twitter @gbnews. So, Rishi Sunak has entered the fray, defending J.K. Rowling after the author highlighted the potential ridiculousness of the new hate crime law that's now in effect in Scotland. Sunak has said people should not be criminalised for stating simple facts on biology. This is, of course, in relation to the transgender debate. A Police Scotland spokesperson has said, "We have received complaints in relation to the social media posts. The comments are not assessed to be criminal and no further action will be taken." That is very latest line on this because, of course, J.K. Rowling put lots of tweets on her Twitter account when this came into force yesterday on the 1st of April. And she cited, here we go, this was one of the first ones, Scotland's Hate Crime Act, she said, comes into effect today. Women gain no additional protections, of course, but well-known trans activist Bev Douglas, darling of prominent blah, 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 lovely Scottish lass and convicted double rapist Isla Bryson found her true, authentic female self. And she said so to respect Isla's pronouns, etc. And fragile flower Kateley Dolatowski, 6'5", was rightly sent to a women's prison in Scotland. So what she's doing here is she is listing the various individuals, transgender people who have been in trouble with the law for, in some cases, sexual offences. And then at the end of it, she says, and I don't believe that these are women, so come and arrest me. Peter, let me come to you. We now know that she won't be investigated by the police. But was she right to raise awareness of this potentially tyrannical piece of law dressed up as concern for vulnerable people?
I think it's a badly drafted law by the Scottish Government, and as I understand it, the police in Scotland have said they may have to investigate fewer crimes like burglaries in order to pursue hate crimes of this nature under the new offence. J.K. Rowling, you know, she's a respected author, she's gender critical, she's entitled to her views. I think I might have put them slightly differently if I was her. She's named 10 people. As I understand it, not all of them have criminal convictions, but several of them do. I think this is such a grave matter, and we're concerned about dignity of trans women, but also the safety of women born female. Before you even get on to how you look after children who are going through these issues, you know, permanent medical changes and so on and so on. I think J.K. Rowling is completely entitled to raise it. I think she could have done it a little bit differently, perhaps with a bit more sensitivity. But
she would say, I guess, that in terms of this debate, she has rarely shown any sensitivity from the other side. From
yes, she's faced terrible abuse, and I think that's also the concern I have, that it's a very inflamed argument. I don't think this new law introduced by Scottish First Minister Humza Yousaf is going to change things. We already know there's so many other areas of public services failing in Scotland, and there's a crisis in drug deaths, and it's incredibly sad and grim that J.K. Rowling has faced such abuse. I think she could have put the point slightly differently. But
you say this hasn't been... The law in itself is not worded correctly. But do we need a law to police hate? Because you can't stop people hating. It's a normal, natural emotion. And if you carry out a violent act, that's a crime. If you threaten a person, that's a crime. But just saying things surely is not... We don't need this sort of legislation, do we?
I can't see the case for it. Now, people will say you shouldn't criminalise language, but some language, as you rightly said, is already criminal. If we have a dispute and they say to you, I'm going to thump you, and you believe that and take it seriously, then that probably is a crime because you're in fear of your safety. But this seems to be something different about criminalising thoughts and beliefs.
Well, if you do actually thump me during the show tonight, Peter, that would be a first. But, Henry, let me come to you. What do you make of it all? Because you presumably, like me, find it quite chilling that we've got this legislation at all.
Yeah, I think that, as you say, not all, but most law focuses on behaviour, right? Because you can't really police motivations. You certainly can't police motivations fairly. And I think that's what's really being highlighted by this. As you say, it's a very badly drafted law. It's not clear what the definition of hate crime is, what will qualify under it, which means that citizens can't preempt it, which is a problem for equality under the law. And what J.K. Rowling is doing is really she's forcing the Scottish government to confront this really awful choice, right? Which is where either she pushes the boundaries of this law in relation to the trans question, and they keep backing off, in which case the law increasingly becomes meaningless, at least within this sphere, or at some point the police bite the bullet and go to trial, which means that they're going to be going to trial with one of the wealthiest women in Britain, a very articulate advocate of her cause, and it would really be a bad press heyday for the law and the government. Now, it's not just this string of tweets. What J.K. Rowling has since said is that if any woman is prosecuted under this law for expressing, I suppose, gender-critical beliefs, she will repeat that woman's words on Twitter and in the media, and then the police will have to charge both of them. So it really is a gauntlet thrown down in a way that I don't think we've really seen very often, this kind of a single individual challenging a government like this.
But wonderful, I think. I mean, as a woman, I'm very reassured that there is such a powerful and wealthy woman out there who isn't afraid to be litigious if the time comes and to take on any sort of challenge against her. But I wonder whether it's all a little bit of a distraction, Peter, from what this it is a snooper's charter, because in Scotland people are being encouraged, aren't they, to if you hear somebody say something that might stir up hatred, this is the phrase, it could be judged by a reasonable person, A, what's a reasonable person, and B, stirring up hatred, well, that could mean anything, against people of protected characteristics. And we're looking at a kind of two-tier society here where you've got people of religious, any particular religion, or sexual orientation, disability or gender identity protected, whereas you two wouldn't be protected under this sort of law. I wouldn't as a straight white woman either. So do we need it for anybody?
Well, there's a political debate around it that we've just been having, but there's also a lawyer's debate, and it's a very boring word, but it does come back to drafting because there are these ambiguities within it, as you picked out. And another one is what constitutes a public statement, so if you go on TV or in a town hall meeting, that's definitely public. What about if you're talking to your family at home or somewhere semi-public, like a pub with your friends? I think that's really your point about snitching, that the Scottish Government, as with any law, they do a public campaign around it, and invite citizens to, in effect, shop other people living in Scotland for the wrong language.
So are you if you're terrified by this, and I am, and you are, who's in favour of this?
I'm not terrified of it, and perhaps for the reasons that Joanne Rowling was alluding to, that it's badly drafted and perhaps it's driven by political sentiment rather than by good law.
What would make it a better piece of legislation, in your opinion, then?
Well, I think you'll have to get a lawyer on the show for that. But I think what's come out in a lot of coverage today is that the ambiguities are manifest. And when you're a police officer being told to prosecute someone with a new law, the one thing you don't want is ambiguity. And J.K. Rowling, because she's a very intelligent person, don't agree with everything, but she's a very clever woman, she sniffed this out immediately. And that's obviously why she's vowing to repeat the words of anyone who is prosecuted. She's therefore further dampening down the likelihood of anyone being prosecuted.
I'm sure if you asked her, she would say she doesn't want to be involved in this at all. She never asked for any of this attention on this issue, but now she finds herself in it. Let's have a look what Humza Yousaf said today on his tweet. So this is the First Minister of Scotland, of course, who is celebrating this legislation. He says, "I do my best to shield my children from the racism and Islamophobia I face on a regular basis. That becomes increasingly difficult when racist graffiti targeting me appears near our family home. A reminder of why we must collectively take a zero-tolerance approach to hatred." And there was a picture on the front page of the newspaper, which I think we can see, which is of the graffiti outside his house. There we go. FM, First Minister targeted in racist graffiti on Ferry Wall. Now, this says an unkind word about Islam. But, Henry, that's a crime of graffiti, and he's using it as an excuse to push through this really draconian legislation. For me, the crime there is graffiti. People have always said unkind things in graffiti.
Well, it's also not just graffiti, it's targeted harassment, right? Especially if that's near his home. And again, that's an action, and that is a specific crime. That is somebody who is not just expressing an opinion about the First Minister, which they are entitled to do. It is somebody who is tracking him down, where his family is, and threatening him. It's exactly the same as threatening to thump someone in a way. So you're right. That is an example of something which is already covered and can be sensibly covered by criminal law, and it is being used to push through this insanely expansive police speech policing thing, which is also intensely subjective because the test is very vague, but it's sort of if someone if someone who had overheard it hypothetically could be offended by it. How do you know, right? And that completely demolishes the wall between private and public speech, because all of us, I imagine, say things in private with groups of people whom we know that we wouldn't say in a public forum. And if suddenly something in a private WhatsApp between you and somebody else can be published, and then somebody says, well, if someone else had been in that chat, they'd have been offended by it, and that's a crime. That is an extraordinary invasion of free speech. And
you can report anonymously, can't you? And if there isn't an actual level of crime, you're still recorded on the database as a hate incident.
But we've got to be clear, however hopeless Humza Yousaf is, no one should face racist graffiti, and no one should certainly face racist graffiti on their home or round the corner, because that is disgraceful. It is disgraceful, but that's a matter of policing. That's local community. That's not necessarily a hate crime. People have always written... I went round Kenilworth Castle yesterday. It was very nice on my way back from the north down to the south. And in the walls there, from the 13th and 14th century, people have scraped their names and they've graffitied things, which were probably unkind about the royal family, especially around the Civil War at the time. This is something that human beings do. It's not the same when it's on your home and a politician's been attacked physically. But it isn't on his home and he hasn't been attacked physically. It says an unkind word, a swear word, about Islam. And the extrapolation is it's specifically at him. It doesn't even name him on this graffiti. And he's using that as a weapon to say, this, you see, this is why we need this terrible, tyrannical piece of legislation. I would disaggregate those things, and you see it with... He hasn't, though. Well, you see it with sexist abuse as well, that sadly female legislators face abuse, whether they're in power or not, whether they're on the front bench, whether they're in a cabinet, when they're backbench. There's this tiny minority of aggressive folk that spray abuse around verbally, electronically, and in some cases on walls, regardless of the kind of laws introduced by the people they're insulting. I think the bit I also find baffling, Henry, is this idea that you can stop hate by stopping people talking. Because for me, hate speech is only solved by more speech. It is I think it's a real problem, because if you think about it, objectively speaking, is this country or any other Western country more or less prejudiced than it was 20 or 30 years ago? Apparently not, if you look at the figures. But in terms of day-to-day experience, people's experience of racism, it definitely still happens, but compared to the past. But the problem now is that with the internet, we're also connected. One, minority groups with hateful attitudes find it much easier to connect to each other, right? 20 years ago, you might have had a really negative opinion of Islam or whatever, but you were probably going to say that everywhere, and therefore you wouldn't have found other people, but people can find each other, and then they can project at politicians and at us. And so a small minority of people can project onto the internet all of their bile, and it looks like a much bigger problem than perhaps it is. Now, it is important that we maintain a zero tolerance towards this kind of thing in public space, because, of course, the people in the 13th and 14th century who were doing that graffiti were killing each other in religious wars, right? Like, the hatred can have real consequences. Yeah. But we're not doing that now. Precisely. Or not here, at least. But it is important that we separate that from this kind of legislation, which is just a grotesque overreach, because ultimately people are not and cannot be compelled by law to think good thoughts in their private lives. Correct. Right, let us know at home what you think. gbviews@gbnews.com is the email address.